Criss by Lynn Ray Perkins. Chapter 28. Mrs. Bruning. When Mrs. Bruning came home, she seemed small. Maybe it was the house that felt bigger. Debbie and Peter had put away or gotten rid of some of the stuff, and it was more spacious. But she seemed smaller even within her house dress, and her skin didn't fit as snugly as it had before. Her brown eyes were still bright, though, under her thin, white dandelion puff of hair. The Brunings had hired a visiting nurse to come and check on her, and they had signed her up for Meals on Wheels. She never would have signed up for it herself, and she didn't like walking able-bodied to the door and accepting food someone else had cooked, but it was part of the deal she'd made with her children. And it made a change from having cereal for dinner or canned soup. She refused to have the housekeeper. She didn't want some stranger in her house handling and moving anything. She insisted that, with Debbie's help, she could manage. Debbie looked around to see if any of the neighbors were at home before going inside Mrs. Bruning's. Once, while she thought Mrs. B was elsewhere in the house, she picked up the phone in the kitchen to make sure there was a dial tone. Mrs. Bruning saw her listening, then carefully lowering the receiver onto the hook. "I don't blame you," she said. "I'd check up on me, too." Mrs. Bruning also noticed that Debbie was going into the living room a lot. When she headed in there again, Mrs. B waited a minute, then tiptoed after her. She wasn't light on her feet, but she knew where the creaky spots were. Standing in the shadowy hallway, she saw that Debbie was just dusting the pictures on the mantelpiece. Disappointed, she was about to sneak away again when Debbie did something that surprised her, then didn't surprise her. Debbie carried one of the framed pictures to a chair and sat down and looked at it. Louise Bruning couldn't see the picture from where she was, but she knew by its size and shape and where it had been sitting that it was a photograph, a couple of years old, of her grandson, Peter. Just for the fun of seeing Debbie jump, she said softly, "I have a newer one. I'll give it to you." Debbie's reaction was satisfying. She looked up as if she'd been caught stealing the silverware. Then she looked around for her dust rag, which she had left on the mantel. She jumped up and grabbed it and started dusting again. "Come out to the kitchen," said Mrs. Bruning. "I think that's where I have it, in a drawer in there." End of Chapter 28. Chapter 29. Elephants. Debbie sat cross-legged on her bed, leaning over a photo album. Just beyond the photo album were the 2 boxes from the closet. The photograph of Peter that Mrs. Bruning had given her was propped up against the hat box in such a way that someone opening the curtain and looking in her room wouldn't see it. The photo album from her mother's college years was open to several photos of Helen Brandt and her friends posed on skis, laughing on a sunny day, snowy hillside in swimsuits. All of them wore red lipstick and had wavy hair. They all looked glamorous in an old-fashioned way. They didn't look like they would ever feel awkward, would ever not know what to say, to a boy or to anyone else. But photo albums aren't a good place to look if you're wondering about things like that. Debbie wondered if it was true that there was only one person in the world for every person, and if she'd already met him, and she either had to find a way to be around him again someday or always be alone, romance-wise. She didn't quite believe this. What seemed more likely was that there were at least 5 or 6 people scattered around the globe who you could bump into, and wham, it would be the right thing. The odds probably varied from person to person. For Criss there were probably 50 or 60 all in the continental U.S., maybe within the tri-state area. Debbie's handful were somewhere in the Himalayas, or the steppes of Russia, or passing by her in a crowd, unsuspecting. So that if she thought she might have found one of them, she shouldn't just give them up. Should she? Debbie heard footsteps, and she quickly stuffed the picture of Peter down between her bed and the wall. The curtain moved, and her mother's head appeared. "You have a letter," she said, "from California." Debbie's heart sprang up and bounded across the room in one jump. The rest of her sat in simulated calmness on her bed. She put an expression of surprised curiosity on her face and said, "I do?" Her mother handed her the letter and leaned on the doorway, waiting to see what it said. She thought it might be a thank-you note, though it felt thicker. Debbie opened the envelope and pulled out a letter and a photo. She couldn't help smiling a little. It was the same picture she already had. She explained to her mother that the letter was from Mrs. Bruning's grandson, the one who had been there the day Mrs. Bruning went to the hospital, the one she'd worked with on Mrs. Bruning's house for those few days. She wanted to let her mother know that he was more than that to her, a lot more, so she said offhandedly, "He was really nice. He was fun to be with." Her mother didn't hear the hidden message, which was, "It was amazing and perfect to be with him, and now my life seems dull and empty." Debbie showed her the photo, thinking, "This will explain everything. Now she will understand." It was a school picture of a boy with chin-length blonde hair parted down the middle and tucked behind his ears. He wore wire-rimmed glasses, a t-shirt, and a denim jacket. So often in books or in movies, one character looks at another character and understands in a precise way what that person is feeling. So often in real life, one person wants to be understood, but obscures her feelings with complicated, unrelated words and facial expressions, while the other person is trying to remember whether she did or didn't turn off the burner under the hard-boiled eggs. Helen did sense something, an undercurrent. She thought that Debbie probably had a crush on this boy, but California was pretty far away, and she couldn't have gotten to know him very well in such a short time. Maybe they would exchange a few letters. "He looks very nice," she said. "He's a cute boy." "He is nice," said Debbie. It was as close as she could come to saying, "I need to go to California, can I?" But it wasn't very close, not close enough. Her mother had no way of knowing that this would have been a good time to tell her daughter that she'd once known a boy who went away. A boy who'd made a game of finding little figures of dogs and giving them to her. They might have talked then about how that felt and what you did next. But their secrets inadvertently sidestepped each other, unaware, like blindfolded elephants crossing the tiny room. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30. What Patty said when Debbie showed her the photo was, "Maybe I could go work for Mrs. Bruning too." End of chapter 30.